A Creole language, or simply a Creole, is a stable natural language that has developed from a pidgin, i.e. a simplified version of a language. Creoles differ from pidgins because Creoles have been nativized by children as their primary language, with the result that they have features of natural languages that are normally missing from pidgins, which are not anyone's first language. The precise number of Creoles is not known, particularly as these are poorly attested, but about 100 Creole languages have arisen since 1500, predominantly based on European languages, due to the age of discovery and the Atlantic slave trade, though there are Creoles based on other languages, including Arabic, Chinese, and Malay. The Creole with the largest number of speakers is Haitian Creole, with about 10 million native speakers. The vocabulary of a Creole language is largely supplied by the parent languages, particularly that of the most dominant group, in the social context of the Creole's construction, though there are often clear phonetic and semantic shifts. On the other hand, the grammar often has original features that may differ substantially from those of the parent languages. Overview. A Creole is believed to arise when a pidgin, developed by adults for use as a second language, becomes the native and primary language of their children, a process known as nativization. The Pidgin Creole life cycle was studied by Hall in the 1960s. Creoles share more grammatical similarities with each other than with the languages from which they are phylogenetically derived. However, there is no widely accepted theory that would account for those perceived similarities. Moreover, no grammatical feature has been shown to be specific to Creoles. Although it is generally acknowledged that Creoles have simpler and less sophisticated grammar than longer established languages. Many of the Creoles known today arose in the last 500 years as a result of the worldwide expansion in European maritime power and trade. In the Age of Discovery, which led to extensive European colonial empires and an intense slave trade. Like most non-official and minority languages, Creoles have generally been regarded as degenerate variants or dialects of their parent languages. Because of that prejudice, many of the Creoles that arose in the European colonies have become extinct. However, political and academic changes in recent decades have improved the status of Creoles, both as living languages and as object of linguistic study. Some Creoles have even been granted the status of official or semi-official language. Linguists now recognize that Creole formation is a universal phenomenon, not limited to the European colonial period, and an important aspect of language evolution. See Vinman. 2003. For example, in 1933 Sigmund Feist postulated a Creole origin for the Germanic languages. Other scholars, such as Sally Kokoma-Fuin, argue that pidgins and Creoles arise independently under different circumstances, and that a pidgin need not always precede a Creole, nor a Creole evolve from a pidgin. Pidgins, according to Mafuin, emerged among trade colonies among users who preserved their native vernaculars for their day-to-day interactions. Creoles, meanwhile, developed in settlement colonies in which speakers of a European language, often indentured servants, whose language would be far from the standard in the first place, interacted extensively with non-European slaves, absorbing certain words and features from the slaves' non-European native languages, resulting in a heavily basilectalized version of the original language. These servants and slaves would come to use the Creole as an everyday vernacular, rather than merely in situations in which contact with the speaker of the superstrate was necessary. History. Origin. The English term Creole comes from French Creole, which is cognate with the Spanish term Criollo and Portuguese Crioulo, all descending from the verb criar, to breed or to raise, all coming from Latin creare, to produce, create. The specific sense of the term was coined in the 16th and 17th century, during the great expansion in European maritime power and trade, that led to the establishment of European colonies in other continents. The terms Criollo and Crioulo were originally qualifiers used throughout the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, to distinguish the members of an ethnic group, who were born and raised locally from those who immigrated as adults. They were most commonly applied to nationals of the colonial power, e.g., to distinguish Espanoles Criollos, people born in the colonies from Spanish ancestors, from Espanoles Peninsulares, those born in the Iberian Peninsula, i.e. Spain. However, in Brazil the term was also used to distinguish between Negros Criollos, blacks born in Brazil from African slave ancestors, and Negros Africanos, born in Africa. Over time, the term and its derivatives, Creole, 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 etc., lost the generic meaning and became the proper name of many distinct ethnic groups that developed locally from immigrant communities. Originally, therefore, the term Creole language meant the speech of any of those Creole peoples. Geographic distribution. As a consequence of colonial European trade patterns, most of the known European-based Creole languages arose in the equatorial belt around the world and in areas with access to the oceans, including the coastal regions of the Americas, Western Africa, Goa, and along the west coast of India, and along the coast of Southeast Asia, up to Indonesia, Singapore, Macau, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaysia, Seychelles, and Oceania, according to whom. Many of those Creoles are now extinct, but others still survive in the Caribbean, the North and East coasts of South America, the Guyanas, Western Africa, Australia, see Australian Creole language, and in the Indian Ocean. Atlantic Creole languages are based on European languages with elements from African and possibly Amerindian languages. Indian Ocean Creole languages are based on European languages with elements from Malagasy and possibly other Asian languages. There are, however, Creoles, like Nubian Songo, that are derived solely from non-European languages. Social and political status. Because of the generally low status of the Creole peoples in the eyes of prior European colonial powers, Creole languages have generally been regarded as degenerate languages, or at best as rudimentary dialects of the politically dominant parent languages. Because of this prejudice, the word Creole was generally used by linguists in opposition to language rather than as a qualifier for it. This prejudice was compounded by the inherent instability of the colonial system, leading to the disappearance of Creole languages, mainly due to dispersion or assimilation of their speech communities. Another factor that may have contributed to the relative neglect of Creole languages in linguistics is that they do not fit the 19th century neo-grammarian tree model for the evolution of languages, and its postulated regularity of sound changes. These critics, including the earliest advocates of the wave model, Johannes Schmidt and Hugo Schuckardt, the forerunners of modern sociolinguistics. This controversy of the late 19th century profoundly shaped modern approaches to the comparative method in historical linguistics and in Creolistics. Creole and use at Carental Counter, USA. Because of social, political, and academic changes brought on by decolonization in the second half of the 20th century, Creole languages have experienced revivals in the past few decades. They are increasingly being used in print and film, and in many cases, their community prestige has improved dramatically. In fact, some have been standardized and are used in local schools and universities around the world. At the same time, linguists have begun to come to the realization that Creole languages are in no way inferior to other languages. They now use the term Creole or Creole language for any language suspected to have undergone creolization, terms that now imply no geographic restrictions nor ethnic prejudices. Classification of Creoles. Historic classification. According to their external history, 4 types of Creoles have been distinguished: plantation Creoles, fort Creoles, maroon Creoles, and Creolized pidgins. By the very nature of a Creole language, the phylogenetic classification of a particular Creole usually is a matter of dispute, especially when the pidgin precursor and its parent tongues, which may have been other Creoles or pidgins, have disappeared before they could be documented. Phylogenetic classification traditionally relies on inheritance of the lexicon, especially of color terms, and of the grammar structure. However, in Creoles, the color lexicon often has mixed origin, and the grammar is largely original. For these reasons, the issue of which language is the parent of a Creole, that is, whether a language should be classified as a Portuguese Creole or English Creole, etc., often has no definitive answer and can become the topic of long-lasting controversies where social prejudices and political considerations may interfere with scientific discussion. Substrate and superstrate. The terms substrate and superstrate are often used when two languages interact. However, the meaning of these terms is reasonably well defined only in second language acquisition or language replacement events, when the native speakers of a certain source language, the substrate, are somehow compelled to abandon it for another target language, the superstrate. The outcome of such an event is that erstwhile speakers of the substrate will use some version of the superstrate, at least in more formal contexts. The substrate may survive as a second language for informal conversation, as demonstrated by the fate of many replaced European languages, such as Etruscan, Breton, and Venetian. The influence of the substrate on the official speech is often limited to pronunciation and a modest number of loan words. The substrate might even disappear altogether without leaving any trace. However, there is dispute over the extent to which the terms substrate and superstrate are applicable to the genesis, or the description of Creole languages. The language replacement model may not be appropriate in Creole formation contexts, where the emerging language is derived from multiple languages, without any one of them being imposed as a replacement for any other. The substratum-superstratum distinction becomes awkward when multiple superstrata must be assumed, such as in Papiamento, when the substratum cannot be identified, or when the presence or the survival of substratal evidence is inferred from mere typological analogies. On the other hand, the distinction may be meaningful when the contributions of each parent language to the resulting Creole can be shown to be very unequal, in a scientifically meaningful way. In the literature on Atlantic Creoles, superstrate usually means European and substrate non-European or African. Decreolization. Since Creole languages rarely attain official status, the speakers of a fully formed Creole may eventually feel compelled to conform their speech to one of the parent languages. This decreolization process typically brings about a post-Creole speech continuum characterized by large-scale variation and hypercorrection in the language. It is generally acknowledged that Creoles have a simpler grammar and more internal variability than older, more established languages. However, these notions are occasionally challenged. See also language complexity. Phylogenetic or typological comparisons of Creole languages have led to divergent conclusions. Similarities are usually higher among Creoles derived from related languages, such as the languages of Europe, than among broader groups that include also Creoles based on non-Indo-European languages, like Nubi or Sango. French-based Creoles in turn are more similar to each other and to varieties of French than to other European-based Creoles. It was observed, in particular, that definite articles are mostly prenominal in English-based Creole languages and English, whereas they are generally postnominal in French Creoles, and in the variety of French that was exported to the colonies in the 17th and 18th century. Moreover, the European languages which gave rise to the Creole languages of European colonies all belong to the same subgroup of Western Indo-European, and have highly convergent grammars, to the point that Worf joined them into a single standard average European language group. French and English are particularly close, since English, through extensive borrowing, is typologically closer to French than to other Germanic languages. Thus the claimed similarities between Creoles may be mere consequences of similar parentage, rather than characteristic features of all Creoles. Creole genesis. There are a variety of theories on the origin of Creole languages, all of which attempt to explain the similarities among them. Ahrens, Miskin, and Smith, 1995, outline a fourfold classification of explanations regarding Creole genesis. Theories focusing on European input. Theories focusing on non-European input. Gradualist and developmental hypotheses. Universalist approaches. Theories focusing on European input. Monogenetic theory of pidgins and Creoles. The monogenetic theory of pigeons and Creoles hypothesizes that they are all derived from a single Mediterranean lingua franca via West African Pidgin Portuguese of the 17th century, re-lexified in the so-called slave factories of Western Africa that were the source of the Atlantic slave trade. This theory was originally formulated by Hugo Schuckardt in the late 19th century and popularized in the late 1950s and early 1960s by Taylor, Whittingham, Thomson, and Stewart. However, this hypothesis is no longer actively investigated. Domestic origin hypothesis. Proposed by Hancock, 1985, for the origin of English-based Creoles of the West Indies. The domestic origin hypothesis argues that, towards the end of the 16th century, English-speaking traders began to settle in the Gambia and Sierra Leone rivers as well as in neighboring areas such as the Bullama and Cherbourg coasts. These settlers intermarried with the local population, leading to mixed populations, and, as a result of this intermarriage, an English pidgin was created. This pidgin was learned by slaves in slave depots, who later on took it to the West Indies, and formed one component of the emerging English Creoles. European dialect origin hypothesis. The French Creoles are the foremost candidates to being the outcome of normal linguistic change, and their Creoleness to be socio-historic in nature, and relative to their colonial origin. Within this theoretical framework, a French Creole is a language phylogenetically based on the French language, more specifically on a 17th-century Koine French extant in Paris, the French Atlantic harbors, and the nascent French colonies. Supporters of this hypothesis suggest that the non-Creole French dialects still spoken in many parts of the Americas share mutual descent from this single Koine. These dialects are found in Canada, mostly in Quebec, and among the Acadian people of the eastern maritime provinces, the Prairies, Louisiana, St. Barthélemy, leeward portion of the island, and as isolates in other parts of the Americas. Approaches under this hypothesis are compatible with gradualism in change and models of imperfect language transmission in koinegenesis. Foreigner talk and baby talk. The foreigner talk (FT) hypothesis argues that a pidgin, or Creole language forms when native speakers attempt to simplify their language in order to address speakers who do not know their language at all. Because of the similarities found in this type of speech and speech directed to a small child, it is also sometimes called baby talk. Ahrens, Miskin, and Smith, 1995, suggest that 4 different processes are involved in creating foreigner talk: accommodation, imitation, telegraphic condensation, conventions. This could explain why Creole languages have much in common, while avoiding a monogenetic model. However, Hinnenkamp, 1984, in analyzing German foreigner talk, claims that it is too inconsistent and unpredictable to provide any model for language learning. The neutrality of this section is disputed. Relevant discussion may be found on the talk page. Please do not remove this message until the dispute is resolved. November 2013. While the simplification of input was supposed to account for Creole simple grammar, commentators have raised a number of criticisms of this explanation. 1. There are a great many grammatical similarities amongst pidgins and Creoles despite having very different lexifier languages. 2. Grammatical simplification can be explained by other processes, i.e. the innate grammar of Bickerton's language bioprogram theory. 3. Speakers of a Creole's lexifier language often fail to understand, without learning the language, the grammar of a pidgin or Creole. 4. Pidgins are more often used amongst speakers of different substrate languages than between such speakers and those of the lexifier language. Another problem with the FT explanation is its potential circularity. Bloomfield, 1933, points out that FT is often based on the imitation of the incorrect speech of the non-natives, that is the pidgin. Therefore one may be mistaken in assuming that the former gave rise to the latter. Imperfect held to learning. The imperfect L2 second language learning hypothesis claims that pidgins are primarily the result of the imperfect L2 learning of the dominant lexifier language by the slaves. Research on naturalistic L2 processes has revealed a number of features of interlanguage systems that are also seen in pidgins and Creoles. Invariant verb forms derived from the infinitive, or the least marked finite verb form. Loss of determiners or use as determiners of demonstrative pronouns, adjectives, or adverbs. Placement of a negative particle in preverbal position. Use of adverbs to express modality. Fixed single word order with no inversion in questions. Reduced or absent nominal plural marking. Imperfect L2 learning is compatible with other approaches, notably the European dialect origin hypothesis and the universalist models of language transmission. Theories focusing on non-European input. Theories focusing on the substrate, or non-European, languages attribute similarities amongst Creoles to the similarities of African substrate languages. These features are often assumed to be transferred from the substrate language to the Creole, or to be preserved invariant from the substrate language. In the Creole, through a process of relexification, the substrate language replaces the native lexical items with lexical material from the superstrate language, while retaining the native grammatical categories. The problem with this explanation is that the postulated substrate languages differ amongst themselves and with Creoles in meaningful ways. Bickerton, 1981, argues that the number and diversity of African languages and the paucity of a historical record on Creole genesis makes determining lexical correspondences a matter of chance. Dillard, 1970, coined the term cafeteria principle to refer to the practice of arbitrarily attributing features of Creoles to the influence of substrate African languages, or assorted substandard dialects of European languages. For a representative debate on this issue, see the contributions to Mafween, 1993, for a more recent view, Park Vol. 2000. Because of the socio-historic similarities amongst many, but by no means all, of the Creoles, the Atlantic slave trade, and the plantation system of the European colonies have been emphasized as factors by linguists such as McWhorter, 1999. Gradualist and developmental hypotheses. One class of Creole might start as pidgins, rudimentary second languages improvised for use between speakers of two or more non-intelligible native languages. Keith Hinholm, in Himes, 1971, suggests that pidgins need three languages to form, with one, the superstrate, being clearly dominant over the others. The lexicon of a pidgin is usually small and drawn from the vocabularies of its speakers, in varying proportions. Morphological details, like word inflections, which usually take years to learn, are omitted. The syntax is kept very simple, usually based on strict word order. In this initial stage, all aspects of the speech syntax, lexicon, and pronunciation tend to be quite variable, especially with regard to the speaker's background. If a pidgin manages to be learned by the children of a community as a native language, it may become fixed and acquire a more complex grammar with fixed phonology, syntax, morphology, and syntactic embedding. Pidgins can become full languages in only a single generation. Creolization is this second stage, where the pidgin language develops into a fully developed native language. The vocabulary, too, will develop to contain more and more items according to a rationale of lexical enrichment. Universalist approaches. Universalist models stress the intervention of specific general processes during the transmission of language from generation to generation, and from speaker to speaker. The process invoked varies, a general tendency towards semantic transparency, first language learning driven by universal process, or general process of discourse organization. The main universalist theory is still Bickerton's language bioprogram theory, proposed in the 1980s. Bickerton claims that Creoles are inventions of the children growing up on newly founded plantations. Around them, they only heard pidgins spoken, without enough structure, to function as natural languages, and the children used their own innate linguistic capacities to transform the pidgin input into a full-fledged language. The alleged common features of all Creoles would then be the consequence of those innate abilities being universal. Recent study. The last decade has seen the emergence of some new questions about the nature of Creoles, in particular, the question of how complex Creoles are, and the question of whether Creoles are indeed exceptional languages. Creole prototype. Some features that distinguish Creole languages from non-Creoles have been proposed by Bickerton. For example, John McWhorter has proposed the following list of features to indicate a Creole prototype. A lack of inflectional morphology, other than at most 2 or 3 inflectional affixes. A lack of tone on monosyllabic words, and a lack of semantically opaque word formation. McWhorter hypothesizes that these 3 properties exactly characterize a Creole. However, the Creole prototype hypothesis has been disputed. Henry Whitman, 1999, and David Gill, 2001, argue that languages such as Manding, Soninka, Magua French, and Riau Indonesian have all these 3 features, but show none of the socio-historic traits of Creole languages. Others, see overview in Miskin and Law, 2001, have demonstrated Creoles that serve as counterexamples to McWhorter's hypothesis. The existence of inflectional morphology in Berbice Dutch Creole, for example, or tone in Papiamento. Exceptionalism. Building up on this discussion, McWhorter proposed that the world's simplest grammars are Creole grammars, claiming that every non-Creole language's grammar is at least as complex as any Creole language's grammar. Gill has replied that Riau Indonesian has a simpler grammar than say Ramakan, the language McWhorter uses as a showcase for his theory. The same objections were raised by Whitman in his 1999 debate with McWhorter. The lack of progress made in defining Creoles in terms of their morphology and syntax has led scholars such as Robert Jodinson, Soliko Comafuin, Michel de Graaf, and Henry Whitman to question the value of Creole as a typological class. They argue that Creoles are structurally no different from any other language, and that Creole is a socio-historic concept, not a linguistic one. Encompassing displaced populations and slavery. Thomas and Ann Kaufman, 1988, spell out the idea of Creole exceptionalism, claiming that Creole languages are an instance of non-genetic language change due to language shift, with abnormal transmission. Gradualists who question the abnormal transmission of languages in a Creole setting, and argue that the processes which created today's Creole languages are no different from universal patterns of language change. Given these objections to Creole as a concept, articles such as Against Creole Exceptionalism by de Graaf and texts like Deconstructing Creole by Ansaldo and Matthews have arisen, which question the idea that Creoles are exceptional in any meaningful way. Additionally, Mafuin, 2002, argues that some Romance languages are potential Creoles, but that they are not considered as such by linguists because of a historical bias against such a view.